What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Nick, and I hope you guys are doing well whenever you are checking out the latest video here on the YouTube channel. Today, my friends, we have another fantastic TV tier list for you guys. One of my favorite types of videos to make. I know you guys enjoy them as well. And today's tier list is going to be on a subject that I've been wanting to do for a couple of months here, which is going to be the best TV channels ranked on a tier list here. We have about 30 or so different channels here for you guys to go over, and I'm going to be giving my opinions on all of these different TV channels, TV networks, from all major categories here. We have some that are broadcast networks, some that are cable networks, and some that are streaming services, and we're going to be ranking them on the world famous 7 tiers, ranging from God tier all the way to the infamous bottom of the barrel. I also have a slideshow prepared so we can go over all of the different shows that these networks offer, and the 3 main things that I'm looking for in judging these networks on to rank on the tier list is going to be the quantity of shows, the quality of shows, and the variety of shows. Do they have different genres? Do they have consistency with those genres, and just the amount of shows represented here for each of these networks? As always, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments here. Do you agree with me or disagree? Any opinions you might have on that, leave them down there, and we can have a nice conversation about it. So without any more delays, let's jump into it here. We have them all in alphabetical order as always, and we're going to start off with ABC here, which is one of those networks that I've been critical of in the past here in some of my previous videos. I think they are definitely inconsistent, but when they hit, they definitely have some great shows to offer. They have a nice variety with a ton of big dramas there you see at the top. They have a great assortment of sitcoms. That's probably my personal favorite genre they offer there, with huge hit shows like Modern Family, Abbott Elementary, Three's Company, some old school ones in there as well, which is great. You have the sort of, I guess you could say, reality shows or sort of, unscripted series with America's Funniest Home Videos and Shark Tank being 2 of their most well-known. You have some of their game shows in here, Celebrity Family Feud, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and Wipeout. You also have their animated series, some old school ones like The Flintstones and Schoolhouse Rock that were great back in the day. GMA as their morning show, and then Jimmy Kimmel Live to round everything out with their late night programming. And then the infamous trash here for ABC, definitely going to dock them a few points here with the Drew Carey Show. That is definitely one of the absolute worst shows of all time. Bottom of the barrel quality for that one individually. But as a whole, I would say ABC is definitely on the good tier here for the overall tier list. Like I said, they have some inconsistency issues, but I think their peaks are definitely pretty strong compared to most, and I think their overall variety is definitely strong than most of these other networks that we're going to take a look at. Following that up, let's take a look at AMC here. This was one of those networks that I think back in like the late 2000s, early 2010s, when they were really popping off with those huge hit dramas, they were definitely on top, and they had some excellent shows around that time, maybe about 10 or 15 years ago. The main 3 that they're definitely known for are The Walking Dead, Breaking Bad, and Mad Men. Between those 3, I mean, those are triple threats right there, those huge hit premium dramas. They're Emmy award-winning shows there. My personal favorite of them definitely being The Walking Dead, but they also offer shows like Better Call Saul, Into the Badlands, Punisher, Fear of the Walking Dead, Kevin Can Fuck Himself, very underrated show, and then some of their newer ones like Lodge 49 and Dark Winds. They also have a couple unscripted shows as well here, with the Talking series with Chris Hardwick, and then Ride with Norman Reedus. Of course, a lot of their brand now is definitely centered on The Walking Dead, all of the spin-offs that they have there, so that's definitely kind of overshadowed a lot of their other smaller shows, and that is something that you could criticize them for, but I think their peak overall was definitely one of the strongest in contention here, and I'm going to put them up at the A1 tier. They definitely do dramas very good. Like I said, their variety is a little inconsistent there as well, and The Walking Dead definitely does overshadow it, so that's definitely going to dock them some points and not put them up all the way in the great tier, but I think A1 tier is definitely a fair placement. Next up here, one of the newcomers to the streaming world, we have Apple TV Plus here. They've definitely been making waves over the past couple of months here with definitely some huge hit dramas like The Morning Show, Severance, Defending Jacob, Pachinko, For All Mankind. Definitely a good assortment there. You have a couple, I guess you could say, like musical type shows. These two connect in that way. Central Park and Schmigadoon, which I really enjoy, and then a handful of good comedies as well, like Ted Lasso definitely being the standout there. The infamous trash for them, I'm going to say, is Carpool Karaoke. I am not a fan of James Corden at all. This show just looks awful to me, so don't know really why they would put so much emphasis on that. Overall, I think Apple TV is definitely a great network here. They definitely have a good amount of quality shows here. The problem is they're just too new to really rank any higher than this. They're definitely still one with a lot of potential, but they just haven't had enough time to really set themselves in a big competitive landscape that is streaming right now. I think they're definitely being overshadowed still by, people like Netflix and Hulu that have been around for so much longer. So give them a few more years and we'll see how they stack up. But as it stands now, I think they have a pretty strong start. And if they can keep some of those big dramas going and make them into really big franchises like some of the other networks have, then they're definitely going to do some big things in the future. Looking at the next one here is the BBC here. There's definitely also a couple international channels that I wanted to include here. The BBC definitely being one of the most notable here. For them, they're probably best known for mostly sitcoms like Fawlty Towers and The Office, the UK edition. Those are two that ranked on the top 100 shows list we did on this channel a while back. So definitely some big critical hits there. You also have a good bevy of dramas for them as well, like Sherlock, Peaky Blinders, Doctor Who, Father Brown, Spooks, Killing Eve, Luther. Those are all really well-known shows. And then a handful of game shows as well, The Weakest Link probably being the best known of them, Dragon's Den, which is kind of similar to Shark Tank, and then The Repair Shop, a cult favorite over in Britain there. For their infamous trash here, I found out this show, it's called Glow Up Britain's Next Makeup Star. Looks like a really bad reality competition, kind of similar to America's Next Top Model in some ways, which I'm definitely not a fan of personally, so that was an easy pick for their worst show there. I think the BBC does some good stuff here, but I'm just not as familiar with most of their content compared to most of the other networks here in the States, so I think a good tier is a fair rank for the BBC. Following them, we have to talk about some of the nostalgic children's channels here. And for the first one up, we got to talk about Cartoon Network and by extension, of course, Adult Swim as well as their more adult block, as the title would imply there. Their notable shows definitely obviously going to center around cartoons and animated shows. So for them, we have regular shows, Steven Universe, Dexter's Laboratory, Over the Garden Wall, Ed, Edd and Eddy, Johnny Bravo, Samurai Jack, Cow and Chicken, We Bare Bears, Ben 10, the Powerpuff Girls. The list just goes on and on there. 4 rows of just fantastic, iconic animated shows. Some more adult shows they also have is stuff like Home Movies, Space Coast to Coast, Metalocalypse, and The Eric Andre Show, which is one of the few Adult Swim shows that is actually live action, which is pretty cool as well. And then some of the other notable Adult Swim offerings are stuff like Rick and Morty, of course, Aqua Teen Hunger Force, Robot Chicken, The Boondocks, Moral Oral, all have cult followings there as well. Definitely Rick and Morty being the most prominent of that batch. The infamous trash for them, definitely the CN Real era when they tried to do live action shows. They had some, a couple decent hits in there, such as Destroy, Build, Destroy with Andrew WK was probably the most popular out of that small era, the few years that they were doing the live action stuff, but it's kind of looked at now as definitely being their worst offerings historically, of course. So for Cartoon Network overall, I'm going to put them at the great tier as well. I think they definitely have, obviously, the animation on lock. Obviously, variety is going to hinder them a little bit here because they don't really offer any dramas or anything like that. So that's really the only main criticism of them. But for cartoons and animation, I mean, they're definitely one of the top, players in that genre. Next up here, we have the CBC here, which is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation here. So this is one of the couple Canadian channels we have represented here on this tier list today. And for them, they don't really have a ton of notable shows that have made their way outside of Canada, but they do have a handful here, so we'll go over them. Starting off with the dramas here, Heartland, Murdoch Mysteries, and Coroner. Those are definitely the big 3 that they still have on to this day that have been on for all, I think, over over 10 years at this point, so very impressive stats for them. For their animation lineup, they have Dragon Tales, George Shrinks, and Roly Polioli. There's definitely some, inconsistencies there depending on who you ask. Some of those shows could be amazing, very nostalgic picks for some people, and then others like Roly Polioli could definitely be very infamous, very, very cringy to watch nowadays. So just depends on who you ask, but they're all very popular in their own right. They have a couple sketch comedy shows here. This hour has 22 minutes, and The Kids in the Hall definitely being their most notable two. And then some more game shows and reality shows as well. Their version of Dragon's Den, which, as I said earlier, is very similar to Shark Tank here. The Great Canadian Baking Show, which is exactly what it sounds like, one of their cooking shows, and then Family Feud Canada. For them, their most infamous show here is called The One Making a Music Star, which is essentially just like an American Idol knockoff, or basically any of those big singing competitions there, but definitely one of the worst sort of versions of that genre executed here as a Canadian version of it. Overall, the CBC, I'm going to put them honestly at just a meh tier because, like I said, they don't really have any shows that stand out that have really made their way into the States that are super notable or super competitive. Probably the best show, in my opinion, they have is honestly something like Family Feud Canada. So, their peaks are definitely a lot lower than most of the other networks. Definitely not, awful or anything. All of these shows are definitely watchable, but they just don't have the same sort of impact as many of the other channels we have going against them here on this tier list. One in particular that definitely has a much stronger case for itself here is CBS. In my opinion, when you just look at the overall broadcast networks here in the States, I think that CBS is overall the best of them, specifically because they focus in on sitcoms and comedy the most out of any of the main genres there. And for me, that's definitely what I value most with TV because it is my favorite genre here. And just taking a look at the list, you can see the variety here, the all the different eras represented, all these different shows coming from different decades and different subgenres as well, like How I Met Your Mother, I Love Lucy, The Big Bang Theory, Rules of Engagement, MASH, The Munsters, Major Dad, Mom, Dick Van Dyke, Mary Tyler Moore, Becker, Murphy Brown, The Nanny, The King of Queens, Yes Dear, and just so much more. There is so much great stuff in there to unpack when it comes to their sitcoms, so that's definitely going to give them a huge thumbs up from me. Next up would be their lineup of dramas here. You have stuff like The Twilight Zone, Criminal Minds, Ghost Whisperer, Person of Interest, the CSI series, the FBI franchise, and Gunsmoke are some of the most popular there. I would say their dramas here are pretty solid as well, but they're definitely more franchise-based. And for me personally, some of them like CSI or something like NCIS are a little overrated. So again, that's just something that depending on who you ask, you could get different results as far as how quality those shows are. Their late night shows, personally speaking, I'm not the biggest fan of their late night programming, but they definitely have the most impact here because you have David Letterman there. He was really one of the first to make, major waves in late night, and he's probably overall the most recognizable host that has done, many, many decades of his career has been in late night TV. So definitely a huge influence there. And then you have Stephen Colbert, who is currently the highest rated, the most popular of all of the major late night shows that are currently airing now. So obviously that's great. And then James Corden here, who I'd argue probably has the biggest online presence on, social media and YouTube. You definitely see a lot of his clips from his show, definitely always making their way through the virality sort of side of things. So that's definitely awesome to see there for CBS. Definitely has their late night game on lock there. For their next category would be the animation and the cartoons, which are Scooby-Doo, the Berenstain Bears, and Tom and Jerry. Definitely not the biggest, amount of shows in that genre, but quality-wise, those are three of my all-time favorites. There, all of those would rank in my top 10 favorite animated shows, so that was obviously going to be a huge factor for me personally. And then next up would be their game shows there. The Price is Right, $64,000 Question, and The Amazing Race are a few of their most notable. And then rounding them out the news magazine programs with 60 Minutes and 48 Hours. Their infamous trash here, this is definitely going to be a hot take, but I would say that Survivor is definitely their worst show by far. I hate Survivor, and I think it's extremely overrated. One of the worst TV shows ever, but I know a lot of people love it, so I can't go too hard on it because it has a huge fan base, but for me personally, I just cannot stand it at all. But overall, even outside of that, I think that CBS overall does the best job here when it comes to the variety here. And then, like I said, those sitcoms, they're definitely putting their main focus and energy into those. That's definitely going to win big points with me because, like I said, that's my favorite genre. So CBS overall, a huge thumbs up. They are the first to get the God tier status. Another British channel here we have is Channel 4, definitely one that I would say is very underrated as far as the overall sort of impact that they've had on British TV as well as American TV. They've actually had a few shows that have crossed over and have made their way onto US networks here, such as Black Mirror, which started its run on Channel 4 for the first 2 seasons and then got picked up by Netflix and then became a massive hit there. You have other dramas like Queer as Folk, which was a cult show in Britain on Channel 4 and then was remade by Showtime in, I think it was like 2001 or, the early 2000s there, and then ran for 5 seasons on Showtime, which is great. You also have the Ali G show with Sacha Baron Cohen, of course, as the lead there, a great sketch comedy show that was picked up by HBO and ran for a couple seasons there. So they just have a lot more sort of impact and have just been a lot more consistent as far as giving American viewers and getting US networks to kind of take notice of their programming there. I think a lot better than the BBC has personally. They also have a good variety of game shows here and reality shows like The Great British Bake Off, Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares, The Circle, Gogglebox, and The Crystal Maze, which I think are all pretty good as well. Their infamous trash, another one of their game shows here is Big Brother, the UK edition. I fucking hate Big Brother, same with Survivor. I think it's just awful, so any mention of it is easily going to be a thumbs down. But like I said, Channel 4 I think is very underrated, and I think they don't get enough attention here in the States and definitely don't get enough credit for just being a very influential sort of, brand when it comes to TV. So I'm going to put them in the great tier alongside Apple and Cartoon Network. I think they've definitely deserved it, and I can't wait to see what they do going forward. Another big cable channel here we have in the States, and as their name would imply, they definitely focus in on the comedy here, is Comedy Central. I think that definitely as far as variety within the comedy space here, they definitely have that in spades. You have, of course, the great animated shows. Their most notable, obviously, going to be South Park there. That's definitely their big moneymaker. But you'll have Brickleberry, the later seasons of Futurama they picked up, and Dr. Katz Professional Therapist with the great H. Jon Benjamin as the lead there. Absolutely legendary voice actor for all sorts of adult animated shows. For some of their more, I guess you could say, like late night shows or kind of like satire type shows, they have The Daily Show, The Colbert Report, and Tosh Point Oh. Those are all very popular. For sketch comedy, you have Key and Peele, Mystery Science Theater 3000, Reno 911, and Chappelle's Show. Key and Peele, definitely my favorite of those. Just love watching the clips on YouTube there. Jordan Peele and Keegan-Michael Key, very, very talented comedians there. And then Workaholics there is just their most well-known traditional sitcom of the bunch as well. For their infamous trash, got to go with Fairview here. Definitely one of the worst reviewed shows of this year, 2022. It was actually, I think, executively produced and or created by Stephen Colbert, as we talked about earlier, who is on a hot streak right now with his late night show, but was just not able to translate his brand of comedy into an animated series and just very much fell flat and has terrible scores across the board there on Rotten Tomatoes, IMDb. Just no one, enjoys this show whatsoever. So definitely their worst offering there, especially from this year. But overall, I'd say Comedy Central definitely, again, deserves a great tier here. I think they definitely have the variety on lock when it comes to comedy, specifically if that's what you're looking for. And I really enjoy a couple of their shows that would definitely rank very high on my personal list, like South Park and Key and Peele, as I mentioned earlier. So overall, another one that gets a great tier. Next up here, we have to discuss the CW here. The poor CW, man, they can never catch a break here. And I hate to be that guy to just put them down while they're already in the hole here, but I also agree that the CW is not really the best network out there. They're definitely becoming more and more kind of known for their superhero type stuff, which, you know, if that's something that you enjoy and you are a big DC guy, then they're definitely going to be the network for you. They have all of those rights, that they have the IPs for, that they've turned into some very iconic shows. But for me personally, I'm just not really, that's just not a genre that I really gravitate towards. I'm not really a big superhero guy. And when I do, enjoy superhero stuff, it's usually Marvel, not DC. So definitely more of a Marvel guy myself. So none of their big, action shows really appeal to someone like me. They do have a couple dramas in there that I think are pretty solid, like Jane the Virgin, I would argue, is pretty good because it's very different and, it's more of a rom-com and has some comedic elements to it as well. But it's definitely not a superhero show, so that's nice them branching out and trying something new. But for the most part, that's, primarily what they're known for there. So most of their dramas, like I said, just not really my cup of tea. For their reality shows, you have stuff like Whose Line Is It Anyway, which I think is overall their best show personally, Penn and Teller Fool Us, and Masters of Illusion for some of their more magic shows, which is kind of interesting. And then Aliens in America as their flagship sitcom there from back in 2007. Their infamous trash here, Oh Sit, bad title aside, of course, is one of the worst shows I've ever seen in my life. It was made in 2012, and it was during the writer's strike, so this was around the time when a lot of TV networks were really pouring their resources into these cheaper, fastly produced reality shows and game shows because they didn't have writers to make, scripted content, so they had to kind of find an alternative there. And this was essentially their version of like a Wipeout sort of type of show where it's like these obstacle courses people were going through and, trip over, and that's supposed to make it funny. It was just terrible, horrible, cringy reality stuff from the CW. So yeah, definitely can recommend throwing that one out the window. But overall for the CW, I mean, I can't really give them any higher than, well, okay, we won't go too hard on them because they do have a couple decent shows. We'll go meh tier. I think that's a fair compromise because, like I said, most of their shows just don't appeal to me, but I don't think they're like objectively bad. So this is just personal preference after all. And for me, I think a meh tier is fair. They're just very middle of the pack when it comes to the overall broadcast networks. One that I can definitely say, though, is extremely overrated, in my opinion, is Disney Plus. I was having a conversation with my good buddy Mike over from Mike's Talks and Thoughts just a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about this exact topic, the best and worst TV networks and streaming services, and we both agree that Disney Plus is definitely the most overhyped of all of them, because again, if you like superhero shows, then this is going to be right up your alley. Even though I do think they do it better than the CW, most of the shows I think are just very forgettable, and the fact that there's so many now, it's just incredibly hard to keep up with all of the stuff that they've been putting out recently. The only one I've seen of the major ones is WandaVision, which was the first one, and I really do enjoy WandaVision, but most of the other shows are way more, centered in on the MCU and, the deeper lore and the story there. I think WandaVision had a lot more of a unique presentation that brought in some more fans of comedy like myself, so it was able to branch out in that respect. But stuff like Loki or Miss Marvel or Hawkeye or stuff like that, that's just pure, MCU action-oriented stuff, which if you're not already caught up with it, and because there's so much to keep up with, it's making that extremely difficult. So for me, that whole section of their library is just not interesting much to someone like me who just doesn't keep up with that stuff regularly. Same thing goes for their Star Wars shows. I'm not really a big Star Wars guy either. Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, and Obi-Wan Kenobi are the main three that people like to discuss online. And again, I haven't seen any of them. I just don't really care much about Star Wars or, those types of franchise shows. They have a couple sports shows as well, the Mighty Ducks Game Changers and Big Shot with John Stamos. I haven't seen either one of these either, but from everything I've heard, these are pretty forgettable. There's not much that's, very memorable about these. They just kind of exist. That's as much as people can say about them. High School Musical, the series, of course, is another one that people like to clown on there. And then the Beatles documentary, The Beatles Get Back, is one of their more, unscripted documentary type shows, which I would be interested in checking that out because obviously I'm a big Beatles guy, but it's just so different than everything else that they have. It's kind of the question of like, is it worth getting a subscription to for one show, right? Are you going to pay $10 a month just to watch one show out of, the billions that exist on Disney Plus? And then for their most infamous show is this weird game show, trivia show called The Big Fib. The only thing I know about it is that Yvette Nicole Brown is on it, which I'm a big fan of her, but the show just looks awful, like terrible, cringy, kind of like an Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader sort of setup, like a knockoff of that. So I don't know, it just looks like a total mess from what I've seen. Drew Gooden actually did a video here on YouTube where he talks about all the different streaming services, picks his best and worst shows for all of them, and that's the one he picked for the worst Disney Plus show. So I trust his opinion on that, and I think that's probably a safe bet for their weakest offering. So overall with Disney Plus, I mean, they do have a couple of decent shows like WandaVision and the Beatles documentary, like I said, I'd be willing to check out. But just because they're so overhyped and so overrated, I'm definitely going to throw them into the bad tier. That's definitely going to be a hot take, and I'm sure I'm going to get some comments against me on that one. But I just think that most of their stuff is very forgettable, very unmemorable, just does not interest me whatsoever. Following them, though, I do have more positive things to say about the Disney Channel, the cable channel that was a big competitor to Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network growing up. I definitely watched it the least of those three, but there were definitely some big shows that made a huge impact, especially in the world of cartoons again. Gravity Falls, Recess, The Proud Family, Kim Possible, Lilo and Stitch, Phineas and Ferb, Starversus, and Big City Greens, I think are the main ones that really stand out as having a lot of impact and good quality storytelling and good quality writing on those shows that can appeal to both kids and adults there. So really, proud of what Disney could do with those shows. Their live action sitcoms, I know that there's a huge market for these, and I know, if you ask the right person again, if they grew up with Disney over something like Nickelodeon, these shows were more, their cups of tea. But for me, I was more of a Nickelodeon guy, and we're going to talk about them a little later in this video. So I don't have too much to say on these, but there was a handful that I did enjoy. Definitely liked, That's So Raven, Wizards of Waverly Place, and Lizzie McGuire would probably be my top three. And then some other cult favorites like Hannah Montana and their Kickin' It, Jessie, Girl Meets World, Good Luck Charlie, those all have big fan bases there, so can't really complain too much about those. And then the other thing that Disney Channel did a lot that definitely set them apart was the made-for-TV movies, the DCOMs there. You have stuff like High School Musical, Lemonade Mouth, Camp Rock, Jump In, Geek Charming, Radio Rebel, Descendants, and Zombies there. Those are all fairly popular, and that's still a tradition they do to this day, definitely more than any other networks, continuing that tradition of doing the made-for-TV movies and the specials there, which I think is pretty cool. And then Kids Incorporated as well. That was one of their earliest ones, kind of like another sketch comedy type show, musical, type sketch show as well. So that's pretty cool stuff. There's some interesting clips on YouTube there with some celebrities that got their start on that show and then became big stars later. So I think that's pretty intriguing. And then for their most infamous show, I'm going to say Jonas here. Of all of the live action sitcoms, that was definitely one of the ones that, didn't really make a big impact, even though the Jonas Brothers were huge, of course. They just didn't really have much comedy chops compared to some of the other actors and actresses they had back in the day. So overall with Disney Channel, I mean, like I said, I appreciate them. I do like a handful of their shows, so I'll put them at least in the good tier there. I definitely, respect them a lot more than what they're doing now with Disney Plus. I think, the nostalgia is definitely a factor in helping kind of put them a little bit higher than some of the other networks in here. But it's just not something, obviously, I would watch nowadays. So that's kind of overall my biggest critique of the Disney Channel. This next one here, Food Network, this is definitely going to be more of a personal pick here. I know that most people watching this probably aren't too big on to the cooking shows and the food-related shows, and of course this is all that Food Network offers, as their name would imply, but this was one that I watch all the time, even still to this very day. I watch a ton of it, so we'll do this one really quick here, most notably for the sort of competition shows and some of the more gimmicky shows like Iron Chef America and Chopped and Guys Grocery Games, Cutthroat Kitchen, stuff like that, which I know are super over the top and kind of dumb, but I personally really enjoy these. They always bring a smile to my face, so can't really complain about those. And then you have the more traditional, just like, host, stand and stir type of show where they're just showcasing what sort of dishes they make for their friends and family. And some of the most popular of those would be like 30-Minute Meals with Rachel Ray, Giada at Home, Barefoot Contessa, Emerald Live, and The Pioneer Woman. So those are all pretty popular, and they still get reruns to this day on there. Good Eats and Unwrapped are more of their like educational type shows, which is pretty cool. Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives, of course, one of their biggest with Guy Fieri. And then my two favorites, Dinner Impossible and Restaurant Impossible with Robert Irvine there. Dinner Impossible, I think, is fantastic. That's probably my favorite show, just of any like Food Network or cooking shows, really, period. Absolutely love Dinner Impossible, and Robert Irvine is awesome, so definitely another one that gets big points with me. Their most infamous show, Mystery Diners, this show is a train wreck. It's so awful. Essentially, they go into a failing restaurant, they set up hidden cameras and try to detect, what is wrong with the place, what staff is causing it to, bottom out in most of these cases, and it is just so boring, so unwatchable. Definitely stay away from that one. Food Network, I mean, obviously I'm going to have a bias here, and I don't expect anyone to agree with me on it unless you are really into the cooking stuff like me, but I think they're an A1 tier personally. I still watch them all this time, all these years later, so they're definitely very nostalgic as well for me, and can't, put them any lower than that. I absolutely love them. One of the other major broadcast networks here, we already talked about CBS and the CW, but transitioning from there, we have Fox now. Now, Fox is another one that I think is overall very well-rounded here. Just pure variety. If we're just looking at that category, they have this the best out of any network on this entire list here. Starting off with those incredible animated shows here, not only just from Fox themselves, but Fox Kids as well, which was their morning block there back in the 90s and early 2000s, gave you a lot of great animated shows for children there. And some of the most notable, of course, being The Simpsons and Family Guy, American Dad, Futurama, Duncanville, Bob's Burgers, Batman the Animated Series, Housebroken, X-Men, King of the Hill. There are just so many names that you could throw there. Fox, easily out of all the broadcast networks, is like the only one really that focuses in on cartoons and animation, so gives them a huge advantage in that regard and really helps them stand out from the rest of the crowd there. For their dramas as well, they have some incredible dramas that I think are very underrated and underappreciated as well, such as 21 Jump Street, which was really one of the first shows that came out right when the series, or right when the network launched rather, back in '87, that really helped propel them into, mainstream popularity, and again, really helped them stand out amongst the rest of the big competitive networks there. You also have the X-Files there, 911, one of my favorites, Ally McBeal, 24, House, Prison Break as well, I know, one of the biggest critical favorites on this list. Party of Five, Glee, New York Undercover, very underrated police procedural. So much good stuff in there as well. Fox Kids also did a couple of dramas in addition to the animated shows, and one of their most popular was Goosebumps as well, which was another nostalgic show that me and my brother Matt watched all the time growing up. So I actually didn't know that it was Fox Kids that did that, so that was really cool to find out, and gave them another big point as far as the nostalgia is concerned. For their sitcoms here, I've been kind of critical of Fox in the past for not having the most consistent lineup of sitcoms, but when you boil it down and you just take the good from it to showcase, the best of the best that they do have some really special ones in there, such as Married with Children, that 70s show, that's probably my favorite overall from this list. Brooklyn Nine-Nine as well with Andy Samberg is great. Malcolm in the Middle, of course, a huge fan favorite. Last Man on Earth, very underrated. And the Bernie Mac Show, rest in peace Bernie Mac, true great comedian he was with his self-titled sitcom. You also have the assortment of Gordon Ramsay cooking shows there, Hell's Kitchen, MasterChef, MasterChef Junior, Kitchen Nightmares, all those fantastic as well. Tracy Ullman's show, In Living Color, and Mad TV. very underrated sketch comedy shows as well. Of course, sketch comedy, a huge market here with dozens and dozens of different shows across all networks. But those three always seem to get sort of left behind in the conversation, don't really get brought up as much as they should. And those are all very influential. Of course, the Tracy Ullman Show was the first appearance of The Simpsons as just a reoccurring segment as part of the show. And then it became so popular that they, of course, gave it their own show. And, look what that brought with The Simpsons there all these years later. So that's very cool to look back on. And then their last main category is going to be their unscripted reality shows, which is going to be mostly music-based stuff like American Idol, The X Factor, The Masked Singer, Beat Shazam, and Don't Forget the Lyrics, as well as America's Most Wanted and Cops kind of fit together there as like the true crime sort of documentary type stuff as well. The infamous trash here, easily their worst comedy by a landslide, is Call Me Kat. That show is unbearably bad. Mayim Bialik, what the hell are you doing, man? You need to get out of there and get back to Jeopardy, man. Just focusing on that. That show is a train wreck. Get it out of here. Awful stuff. But even just ignoring that, I think Fox as well, along with CBS, has the variety in check. They have the quality in check. They have the quantity in check. They hit all the major boxes here with tons of quality, tons, of great different types of shows here in all major categories. They are a true force to be reckoned with. Transitioning from that, this is another network that I think is very underrated here and has really grown in just the past maybe year or so. Because before then, they were definitely well known, but really just in the past couple of months, they've been really pushing out some incredible dramas here and incredible shows. And that is going to be FX and FXX and FX on Hulu. They have a lot of different outlets that they stretch out to, but they all formulate back to FX there. And like I said, the dramas here are definitely what they're most well known for, with The Bear currently being the best rated show across multiple sites on as far as the best shows of 2022. It's definitely my favorite show currently of the year, so that's a great one to watch if you're interested in that. You have The Americans in there, Fargo, The Shield, American Horror Story, and by extension, American Crime Story. You have Sons of Anarchy in there, and Mayans MC, of course, Snowfall, Rescue Me with Dennis Leary, which is very underrated. So just a ton of fantastic dramas here. They're pushing out new stuff seemingly every single week. The Old Man in there as well. One of the most recent additions with John Lithgow, of course, so definitely excited to check that out. So just has the drama in check for sure. For the comedies here, I think a little bit less, quality for these, because some of these shows I do think are a little overrated, like It's Always Sunny, which is definitely their flagship sitcom here. But they do have some pretty underrated stuff in here, like Sex, Drugs, Rock and Roll, Atlanta, of course, with Childish Gambino, Dave with Lil Dicky in there, Archer as their animated sitcom, and then a couple that, I would put on here as well if I had the space is stuff like You're the Worst as well. I think is very underrated. Definitely, can include that in this league as well. And then Anger Management, of course, with Charlie Sheen is a pretty good show. So, not the most consistent, like I said, but definitely has a nice variety to it. And some of those shows I think are very underrated. And then finally, Breakfast Time here. Classic morning show was one of their first from like 1994 or 1993 when they first started a long time ago. This was one of their flagship shows, and if you know, I'll just leave it at that. The infamous trash show Black White. This show was an absolute disaster, man. This show had a lot of controversy behind it. It was a really bad execution of a really bad setup to begin with here. It was produced by Ice Cube here, which is really sad to see such a big name get dragged through the mud there. But again, ignoring that here, I'm going to put FX in the A1 tier. I think they absolutely rock with the dramas here. The comedies are super solid. They have some great cult shows like Breakfast Time. They are just another one that has a ton of potential, and I think they're just going to get even better and better as time goes on. Another one here that I think has a ton of potential still, but is quickly losing ground, especially in the streaming world, is HBO and HBO Max. Now, there is definitely an argument to be had that when you look at just peak quality is concerned, especially with those dramas, once again, The Sopranos, The Wire, Game of Thrones, 6 Feet Under, Euphoria right now, Barry, super great as well. You have some underrated shows in there like Rome or True Detective. The Flight Attendant is awesome. When you look at the peak quality that HBO brings to the table, I think it's clear cut that they are at the top every single time. But the big problem they're having right now is just simply the fact that they don't really have a strategy going forward as far as being competitive enough to stand against some of these newcomers here like Apple or FX. And I think one of the things that is holding them back is kind of their ego and thinking that they have the legacy that people are going to be drawn to watching these older shows, but a lot of their newer stuff just doesn't really have the same impact or, isn't really as exciting as it once was. They're also completely ignoring the animation here, with really only one show being very notable in that category, which is Harold and the Purple Crayon, which is a show from like 20 years ago, right? So they have almost no animated shows to offer to new customers as well with HBO Max. So that's definitely another one that's going to hinder them a little bit in the overall ranking. Their sitcoms as well: Larry Sanders Show, Veep, Curb Your Enthusiasm, Eastbound and Down, and Silicon Valley. I'd say that's a pretty solid top 5 there for their comedies. And then you can't forget about Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, probably my favorite late night show currently. Absolutely love John Oliver. He is just an absolute treasure there. It's one of the highest rated shows as well for HBO on IMDb, so that's always great to see. And then you also have to comment in on the infamous trash here. This is one of the few channels that I had to put 2 in there because both of these are just absolutely awful, but I also wanted to include, a bad one for HBO traditionally, which is Lucky Louie, and then a HBO Max show, which is going to be Santa Inc. If you saw the roasting the worst shows that I did with Mike and Matt a couple months ago, then you'll know that Santa Inc., man, this is exactly what I'm talking about here with the animated shows where they just don't care. They just do not give a shit about animated shows or cartoons here. It's one of the biggest genres. It's one of the biggest markets that they should be able to nail every time. And they're just throwing shit out like Santa Inc. and just not giving a damn about what shows, these quality of these shows here. It's just very disappointing to see, how sort of low their standards have become in one of the biggest genres on TV. And then with Lucky Louie, this show is just a train wreck as well. Louis C.K. Was once, very famed comedian. This was one of his first shows that he did back in 2006. And this thing is just raunchy. There's, scenes where he is just fully nude and stuff. And it is just a terrible, terrible show. It's just not very funny at all. Storylines are a complete mess. I'm not a big Louis C.K. fan at all, but I know a lot of people are. And this show does have a bit of a cult fan base somehow. But there are just some scenes in here that are just so bad that I can't defend them personally. So even though HBO does have a lot of faults here, I can't necessarily say that they're one of the worst channels out there, because like I said, with peak quality, I mean, they definitely have that in spades over a ton of these other networks. But I think just as it stands right now, I can only put them at the great tier. They are definitely losing a lot of sort of their reputation, is definitely in question right now. And HBO Max just kind of fumbled the ball as far as the streaming game goes, which is really the future of where their brand is going there. Not so much just HBO as itself right now. It's more HBO Max is what they're focusing in on, and they just don't have the competitive edge they once did. So very disappointing to see. Obviously, the legacy is going to save them in the rank here. Definitely still put them up at least the great tier. But, give them a couple more months or, by the end of the year, and we'll see where they stand. They could be in real trouble by then, and we'll just have to wait and see. One that I think is not going to be in that same position, thankfully, is Hulu here, which is currently my favorite streaming service that any of these brands is offering right now. Here in my family, what we watch, we have both HBO Max and Hulu, and we use Hulu pretty much every single day because not only do they have awesome originals in major categories there, but they also have the features that give you live TV, that gives you cable there. I think their UI is really good. It's really nice to navigate through. The biggest problem with Hulu, just as it stands, is the ads there. That is definitely very annoying, I will say. But we're not judging that in the course of this tier list here. We're just looking at the shows in question. And Hulu has a lot of good ones there. Not, a ton quantity-wise, but they definitely focus in on quality over quantity for the most part. They have stuff like The Handmaid's Tale, which is one of my parents' favorites. Pam and Tommy, which was great. The Dropout, which I definitely want to get more into. Love, Victor, great little miniseries. And then Dope Stick as well, with a great cast there. Very solid top 5 currently for their dramas there. Same thing goes with their comedies there. How I Met Your Father, of course, one of my favorites. You have stuff like Maggie that just came out that had a huge burst in popularity, big fan base forming for that one. The Orville there with Seth MacFarlane, that was originally on Fox, and then Hulu picked it up, and it just exploded in popularity, so that's fantastic to see. Pen 15, great cult show, and then Only Murders in the Building, which is my mom's current favorite show on TV. She's absolutely loving this one. The cast is great on there, has a nice mix of comedy and drama as well, so that's definitely a fan favorite. And then some of their more underappreciated cartoons as well here, The Awesomes, Solar Opposites, and Crossing Swords, which the latter of which was created by Matt Groening of The Simpsons fame, which is awesome. Their infamous trash here, got to give it to the Kardashians, man. Just not really a big fan of them whatsoever. I appreciate their brand, and I can kind of see why. For the right crowd, they would be an interesting family to watch and to kind of, keep up with, as the title would imply. But I think their first show was definitely a lot better at that. This new one just seems like, very selfish, self-centered kind of attitude that they have towards the show, and they just have like a big ego about themselves, which I think is a major turnoff. So yeah, I don't really want any part to do with that. But like I said, all their other stuff really makes up for it. I think of all of the major streaming services, I'm going to say by the end of 2023, let's give it like a solid amount of time there, year and a half or so, I think that Hulu is going to be the best one, if they aren't already, honestly. They could be. They're definitely my favorite, but in the overall grand scheme of things, I think HBO still has a little bit more, legacy with some people. I think Netflix still has a big chokehold on it, but for me personally, I think Hulu is the top dog right now and definitely earns themselves a spot in the A1 tier. Transitioning to something very much on the opposite spectrum, we have MTV here. MTV back in, the 90s, or even earlier than that, in the 80s when they first premiered, they were one of the hottest, most relevant networks on TV. All they played, of course, was music videos, and that's kind of what their legacy is built around, music and music-related programming. But ever since, maybe like the early 2000s or so, they have slowly but surely been weaning off of the music-related stuff and more into the just, kind of lowbrow reality, trashy type of TV that, is easily clowned on nowadays. And that makes up the bulk of their original stuff now. So you have stuff in there like The Real World, 16 and Pregnant, Catfish, the TV show, Teen Mom, Jackass, all those kind of trashy reality shows that are just kind of fun to watch and make fun of, but obviously not something that's going to be very memorable. They have a few dramas as well. They've tried, to do some more serious topics, more mature shows over the years, and some of it's paid off. Like Scream is probably their most popular. Teen Wolf also big, but then some have just completely flopped. Like Eye Candy with Victoria Justice was just a big disappointment, canceled after one season. So very inconsistent in that category. For their animated shows, they have Beavis and Butthead, Daria, and Clone High. Those are all very big fan favorites there. Beavis and Butthead, of course, just came back with the 2022 edition on Paramount Plus, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this video there. Total Request Live and Yo! MTV Raps, two of their biggest, music-related shows that still had some legacy behind them that I think, are probably the most nostalgic for some people who grew up in that era of MTV. MTV Unplugged Concerts was their concert series. They still occasionally do them nowadays, but definitely not to the same, degree as they once did back in the 90s again. And then you can't talk about MTV without mentioning ridiculousness, which is what it is, because they play it a billion times a day. There's literally just like, entire weeks sometimes where that's literally all they'll play. They'll just keep ridiculousness on the whole fucking time. And that show has just completely overshadowed their brand. I heard a stat. I was watching a video by Patrick CC not too long ago, who's another great, TV YouTuber. He does these really in-depth documentary type of videos on different TV networks and TV stars. And he did one on MTV and ridiculousness. And I think they said like 60% of the stuff that they air is just episodes of that, just reruns of that show. So it's definitely overshadowed their, legacy, which is very disappointing. I know it has a big fan base, but I've just never really been that impressed with it. Just a very cheap, version of like America's Funniest Home Videos or something like that. And then for their infamous show, you got to give it to the Jersey Shore, of course. That was really the show that I think propelled them into the reality, sort of trashy TV sort of brand that they are now, because that show just blew up out of nowhere, became a huge runaway success, and then kind of led them down this path that they are currently still in. So MTV, they have legacy behind them for sure. But as they stand now, I mean, I got to give them a meh here, because most of those other shows, the reality shows are just not for me at all. Really, the ones that stand out are going to be stuff like Beavis and Butthead, Daria, Clone High. I think their, animated stuff is really good. And then obviously just the legacy of MTV with the music videos and being very notable and being very relevant for the time, having kind of what, was very popular within the culture, just kind of having their finger on the pulse in that regard, I think is very impressive and very notable, that you got to give them credit for that. But as it stands now, I mean, it's definitely something that I wouldn't watch nowadays whatsoever. Moving on to another one of the major broadcasters here, we have NBC. And for me, I think this is going to be the final one that we see get all the way up into the God tier status, because again, NBC, similar to CBS and Fox, they have the variety on lock, they have the quality, and they have the quantity. Their drama series, this is probably the most viewed for me personally, as far as just current relevant TV that I watch new when it comes out week after week here, are these big dramas, especially with the Law & Order and the One Chicago franchises. Absolutely love those. So those are definitely the ones that I'm watching all the time here. Star Trek, the original series, very, very influential show. You have Hill Street Blues in there. St. Elsewhere, one of the best medical shows ever. ER, same thing with that. LA Law, Siberia, very underrated. They have a great lineup of dramas here in all different categories. Then you also have to talk about their huge array of sitcoms here. Seinfeld, Friends, Cheers, The Cosby Show, Third Rock from the Sun, Will and Grace, News Radio, The Good Place, Community, Parks and Rec, Scrubs, The Office, Mad About You, My Name is Earl. Tons of great stuff there. Their late night programming, I think, is overall the best here because, of course, it has SNL in there, my favorite sketch comedy show ever, my favorite late night show ever. That's easily going to win them huge points there. That's a top 5 of all time for me. So easily going to rep them huge on this tier list. Alongside The Tonight Show and Late Night with Seth Meyers currently, and then Jimmy Fallon on The Tonight Show, which are very fun, personable hosts that I like to watch from time to time. Their reality shows, I think this is definitely one of their weaker categories because, none of these shows are awful, but they're not very, interesting. They don't really have a lot of impact either. They kind of just exist in their own, isolated sort of way on TV. There's not really a lot of shows like them, but that's for a reason that they're not the most interesting out there. You have stuff like American Ninja Warrior, The Apprentice, Biggest Loser, America's Got Talent, Last Comic Standing, and The Voice. I think they're just okay. There's a couple decent ones in there, but it's not really definitely one of their stronger genres, like I said. And then for their more traditional daytime game shows, they also have Jeopardy, Hollywood Squares, and Deal or No Deal. Their worst show, in my opinion, definitely is another late night show, which is A Little Late with Lily Singh. This show has gotten absolutely absolutely trounced on online since it premiered back a couple years ago. This thing has, I think it was at one point, I'm not sure if this stat still remains, but I think it was at one point the lowest rated show, like period, on IMDb. I think it had like a 1.1 or something out of 10. It was absolutely abysmal. Lilly Singh is a huge figure for YouTube. That's what she's most known for. She grew her YouTube channel from decades ago. Has been on the platform pretty much since its inception, and then slowly but surely grew up a fan base of over 15 million subscribers. So I guess they figured that would translate to big ratings on a traditional TV show, but it just did not pay off at all for them, and the results kind of speak for themselves there. So obviously that's one to ignore as well for the NBC. But like I said, I think that they easily get the God tier status here. I mean, the dramas and the sitcoms alone are totally going to carry them up there. SNL, of course, being one of my all-time favorites. Definitely got to give them props there. There's really not that much to complain about NBC. Most of their stuff, the biggest criticisms you can give aside from Lilly Singh there is just that some of their stuff isn't as memorable, but it's not really that it's offensively bad like some of these other networks are. Speaking of which, we have Netflix now. Now, I don't think Netflix is that bad, but I do think they are a little bit overhyped here. Same thing with Disney Plus, as I mentioned earlier. Definitely, again, dramas are going to be their big moneymaker here with huge hits like Stranger Things, Ozark, 13 Reasons Why, House of Cards, Glow, Orange is the New Black, The Crown, Daredevil, Queen's Gambit, Squid Game, Cobra Kai, and The Witcher are some of their most notable. You have some of their, again, cartoons here with Big Mouth, BoJack Horseman, Paradise PD, F is for Family, and Hilda. Some of their more traditional live-action comedies would be Fuller House, Friends from College, The Kaminsky Method, Grace and Frankie, and No Good Nick. And then Tiger King, of course, I had to throw in here, which could have been the infamous trash pick for Netflix if it wasn't for a little show called The Ranch, which I think is just unbearably bad. I'm a huge fan of that 70s show, as I said earlier, and I really enjoy Danny Masterson and Ashton Kutcher on that 70s show, but man, this is just really bad, like bottom of the barrel, very, very low bar for the humor. Sam Elliott, can't even save this show, which is very disappointing because he's been on previous sitcoms like Parks and Rec. He had a very memorable guest spot, and you'd think that he'd be really good in a traditional sitcom again, but his talents can't even save it. And then there was just a lot of really bad attempts to kind of bank off of nostalgia for that 70s show, having the guest spots on from Wilmer Valderrama and Deborah Jo Rupp and people like that. So it was just kind of a vanity project for them, and I just don't think really that many people enjoyed it. But anyways, going back to the positives here with Netflix, definitely, like I said, their dramas here are going to be massive. I do think that there are a handful in here that are kind of overrated. I would say House of Cards is probably the number one for me because it's of the ones I've seen, I think it's the most overrated. You could argue Squid Game or 13 Reasons Why, maybe had kind of disappointing finishes that I know some people were kind of let down by, that thought that those shows were kind of overrated. I know a lot of people think Stranger Things is overrated. I really enjoy it personally, but that's another one that you can make an argument for. Overall, I don't think Netflix is bad, but I do think that they are just kind of complacent in their sort of competitiveness, I guess you could say. It's kind of hard to describe, but like I was kind of saying earlier about HBO, I think one of their big challenges right now is just staying relevant and staying current with the new batch of streaming services that is coming out. I think they've definitely been challenged as far as the amount of original shows that are a lot more unique and kind of stand out more against the field than Netflix can offer right now. And I think they're kind of banking off of what, sort of syndicated stuff they can get and sort of, old IPs that they can acquire that will draw people in, as well as just having, these big shows like Stranger Things that have to carry their entire lineup for, months on end because it's all that they promote, right? Like Stranger Things 4 was like the only show they were advertising for months until it came out. And then obviously with the popularity of it just being so sustainable, they don't have to worry about that show in particular, but they just ignore all the other ones they have that deserve just as much attention from them. So that's really the biggest issue with Netflix, is just complacency. But outside of that, I mean, if you're just looking at the quality of shows, they still have a really good lineup. So can't knock them too much. I think Great Tier is fair for them. We have to now address the third and, in my opinion, the best of the nostalgic kids channels there from back in the day, which of course is going to be Nickelodeon here. If you take a look at their cartoons or their live action sitcoms, I think that equally both of these are fantastic here, starting with those cartoons: SpongeBob, Doug, Rugrats, Ren and Stimpy, Fairly Odd Parents, Ah Real Monsters, Hey Arnold, Tough Puppy, The Angry Beavers, My Life as a Teenage Robot, Danny Phantom, Avatar: The Last Airbender, and Kablam here. Great assortment here, great variety. Nothing more needs to be said for that. For the sitcoms here, we have Drake and Josh, Big Time Rush, Clarissa Explains It All, Ned's Declassified School Survival Guide, Zoe 101, iCarly, True Jackson VP, Adventures of Pete and Pete, Victorious, Game Shakers, and School of Rock. There's definitely a few in there that I've made comments on before that I think are kind of overrated, like Zoe 101, I'd probably say is overall the weakest of those, but there's obviously a ton of nostalgic ones in there, Drake and Josh definitely being the one that even still to this day, a lot of adults really enjoy, even though it's obviously meant for kids, which is great to see. A great assortment as well of sketch comedy stuff, all that, The Amanda Show and Pinwheel are very iconic, very influential shows for that genre. And then you also have Are You Afraid of the Dark, which is very similar to Goosebumps in that it is more of a drama horror series aimed at kids, which is a very unique, tough thing to pull off, but they were very successful in doing that, so got to give them props there. The Infamous Trash here, this is another one where I just couldn't nail it down to just one, because there's two here that definitely deserve this title. The first one definitely being Henry Danger. I mean, I've talked about Henry Danger in the past. That is the worst show on TV. I have made up my mind definitively. That is the single worst show in existence here. It is just awful. So nobody needs to suffer that. Avoid it at all costs. But the other one I found out about recently that I didn't really know all that much about until I started looking into it was this show called Nick Studio 10. It was a very short-lived, I guess you could say, sketch comedy type. I guess that's what they were going for, but it absolutely did not pay off at all, and it was abysmal. To this day, it has a 1.1 on IMDb, so again, one of the lowest rated shows, just period there. Actually featured Noah from Smosh, interestingly enough, was one of his first roles. And, you know, it'd be this group of kids and they would do these challenges, or they would do, you know, little skits or little bits like that to kind of break the monotony of some of the cartoons they were showing. And they would kind of air them alongside the commercials there. So it was kind of like, you know, a show within a show, if you will. They'd have guest stars on there sometimes, like Jeanette McCurdy was on a couple of their segments promoting stuff like Sam and Cat, right? But it just didn't really pay off for them. And it was just kind of a you know, big experiment gone wrong, if you will, is kind of the best way to describe it. But again, ignoring that, looking at the best of the best they had to offer, I think Nickelodeon easily is in the A1 category. Like I said, it's my favorite over Disney or Cartoon Network, which both definitely had, you know, their strong spots, but Nickelodeon for me was just overall the goated of the three. Next up here, we have Paramount Plus. This is another, you know, one of the newer streaming services that is kind of making their run here with a nice variety of shows. This is something that me and my mom were actually talking about not too long ago, and I was saying how, you know, Paramount Plus, the one thing that they're really, really strong with, and that I think is going to help them going forward, is just the fact that they have so many big IPs to existing shows like Halo and iCarly, and they are getting the Yellowstone prequels here, like 1883, which is one of their big dramas here. And all of those are with different audiences. All of those are with different crowds. They're very different demographics, that they're going to have the most unique assortment of people and customers going forward, that I think they're really going to find a strong suit with just giving variety to, right? Because most of these channels we've talked about, especially the cable channels, like say like a Food Network, for example, that demographic is pretty much going to be the same with every single show, right? If you like cooking shows, if you like, you know, very relaxed lifestyle shows, Food Network is going to be your place. But with Paramount Plus, you can go there and you can find stuff that draws, you know, to people that like the more gritty, hardcore dramas. You can find stuff that appeals to the animated shows. You can find stuff that appeals to the comedic shows as well, you know, the sitcoms and such. So it just has a lot more variety, a lot more different people that are going to be drawn into Paramount. And currently, I mean, they're one of the fastest growing as far as the streaming services, and they're just picking up more and more IPs as they go on. Star Trek as well is another huge one that they're getting. All of the spin-offs, all the, you know, recent Star Trek shows are coming to Paramount. So that's a huge franchise that they have the rights to. The Offer, which was the story of The Godfather. I mean, of course, everyone loves The Godfather, so got to check out that show, how it was made. You have stuff in there like Rugrats, Big Nate. They have the rights to now with the animated shows, and then they've even sort of rebranded and picked up shows like The Game as well, which was an old sitcom that was on the CW and UPN back in the mid-2000s that they are doing the reboot for. But that leads me to my other point about Paramount, which is the opposite side of that, which is the fact that pretty much all of their stuff is, already IPs that, are already existing, right? And it's all reboots and it's all spin-offs and such. And that comes with a lot of backlash online. A lot of people want, more original content. They really don't have a single show currently that isn't like that, right? Every one of their main shows, iCarly, Halo, Star Trek, whatever, is already an existing franchise, and that's just going to anger a lot of people. So it's going to be very difficult to balance those two and trying to get people to come to them without those big franchises, but also having to balance the, anger and the frustration that comes with just all these reboot announcements that they're going to be making over the next couple of months. The most infamous of them being the Fairly Odd Parents, Fairly Odder, which is easily one of the worst live action reboots that any of these networks have done with such a beloved cartoon as the Fairly Odd Parents. As they stand now, I really like Paramount. I think there's a lot of good stuff in there, but I am kind of hedging my bets that they won't be as successful going forward as some of the other franchises. I think Hulu and even Netflix still will always have the upper hand above them, but it's just going to be really interesting to see what else they can pick up. And once they get enough traction, when they do start making very original content, how that ends up playing out in their favor or against them, depending on how they execute it. Another Paramount branded channel here is Paramount Channel, which was formerly Spike TV. Definitely don't have a lot of shows, but the ones they do are extremely popular in their respective categories. The most notable of them easily being Yellowstone, which, I mean, if you just take a look at just the objective figures they're putting up, the objective numbers, Yellowstone is easily the biggest show on TV right now, the biggest drama for sure. So easily a massive win for them there. Bar Rescue, Lip Sync Battle, and Ink Master are the reality shows there. Some good stuff in there. I like Bar Rescue as kind of a guilty pleasure there. I think John Taffer is kind of a crazy guy, but he's fun to watch every once in a while. And then for their sitcom there, you have Blue Mountain State, which I've heard very mixed things about. I haven't seen that much of it, so I can't fully judge, but some people love it. Some people absolutely hate it. So it's just kind of one of those, again, if it kind of fits as your cup of tea, it's probably going to be something you enjoy. If not, probably one that you won't. And then for their infamous trash here, one of their older Spike shows is Manswers here, which is just a crazy fucking show that pretty much had every component of Spike TV locked into one show. If you want more of a detailed explanation, I would recommend Curtis Connor's video on it. He grew up with Spike TV, and he has a whole video dedicated to Manswers there, and it's very funny, so I'd recommend checking that out. I don't think Paramount's bad by any means, but obviously Paramount Plus is where a lot of their energy and focus is going to go into. And aside from Yellowstone, they just don't have that much other stuff to talk about. So I think a Met here is a fair placement for them. We are coming down up onto the last few shows here, so we'll run through these fairly quickly here, starting through with PBS Kids and Create, again, all under the same umbrella parent company, which is PBS here. Definitely most notable for their kids content, both, again, live action and cartoons there that also offer a more educational spin on the genre there. Some of the most notable shows: Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Sesame Street, The The Electric Company, Reading Rainbow, Bill Nye the Science Guy, Between the Lions, and Odd Squad, one of my favorites that I think, again, is very overlooked. For their cartoons, you have stuff in there like Arthur, the Berenstain Bears, Cyber Chase, The Magic School Bus, Dragon Tales, Clifford, George Shrinks, and so many more. A lot of these were ones that me and Matt really grew up with watching even before we were watching stuff on Nickelodeon or Disney Channel. We watched a lot of PBS growing up because we didn't have cable, so the only times that we got to watch, SpongeBob or regular show or something like that was when we visited our grandma's house, which was, about once a week. But the rest of the time we were watching PBS cartoons. So we grew up with a ton of these. And obviously a lot of them still are airing to this day. For Create, that side of it is going to be more the lifestyle shows and a lot of great cooking shows that we watch all the time still regularly. America's Test Kitchen, Cook's Country, The French Chef, Kevin Belton, Road Food, Christopher Kimball's Milk Street, Simply Ming. There's a lot of different variety there. They don't have any competition cooking shows like Food Network does or even like Fox does with the Gordon Ramsay stuff, but a lot of the more, educational, very casual stuff that's just really great if you want something very simple to relax after a long day. The more, documentary type, news types of shows they have also are Nova, POV, Independent Lenses, Nature, Frontline Jazz, and the PBS NewsHour. You also have Charlie Rose and Tavis Smiley. I guess you could call those like talk shows. I think they did air during late night, so you could technically call them late night talk shows, but they're very different than like a Jimmy Fallon or something. They're a lot more serious, a lot more mature, very, highbrow, intelligent sort of guests they'll bring on. So it's kind of interesting as an alternative there. And then some of the more miscellaneous stuff they have is like Antiques Roadshow or Austin City Limits, which is one of their concert series, very similar to like an MTV Unplugged. They'll focus in on a band and they'll perform a concert, which is very cool. The infamous trash here, Barney and Friends. Everyone knows Barney, of course, how bad Barney can be. Don't need to go too deep on that. Honestly, this might be a hot take, but I think PBS is definitely one of the strongest here. It's very much like the people that appreciate PBS are the same people that, didn't grow up with a lot of choices, right? They maybe didn't have cable. It was definitely before a time with all these streaming services. I mean, now, me and Matt are obviously older, so we watch a ton more stuff, but it really does tap into like a very niche, but very, very strong community of people that, are very nostalgic for this type of stuff and just appreciate a lot more simplicity with their TV. Don't need, these huge, crazy, big action IPs and, these big dramas that are, hundreds of millions of dollars spent on these. They just want something that's very casual and very calming to watch. Like I said, after a long day of work, these are very, very fun shows to turn on, just kind of relax to and turn your brain off to. And there's a nice variety here. You have stuff for the kids. You have a lot more mature adult stuff. Like I said, like those talk shows there. You have music in here. You have the cooking shows. So it's a nice variety as well. So all things told, I mean, PBS, I think they're an A1 tier for sure. Showtime here. This is another big premium cable channel that kind of has some competitive edge alongside an HBO or something, but they never quite get the same treatment as far as the sort of recognizability. And I think part of that is just because a lot of their shows are very ambitious, but the execution here is a little more questionable in some cases. And probably the best example of that is something like Dexter, which, I mean, if you don't already know, Dexter at one point was one of the best shows on TV, and for a lot of people is still considered one of the best shows of all time. But the execution of those finales, man, both with Dexter and Dexter New Blood, has really kind of, overshadowed and undermined a lot of the good that the franchise was able to do. So that's just kind of an example of the essence or kind of the ethos of Showtime is they just never really fully commit and really nail the execution as much as people would want to. And I think that's partly one of the reasons why HBO seems to just overshadow them much more than, they would be willing to, or, that they would want to rather. But some of their other shows outside of Dexter that are really big are like Californication, Weeds, Stargate SG-1, Soul Food, Yellow Jackets was a big show this year. Got a lot of Emmy love. Billions, Shameless, which is, one of their bigger comedy dramas there. Ray Donovan, one of their big legal dramas. So a nice variety in that regard, but like I said, some of these maybe not the most memorable, or kind of have some, plot holes here and there, that kind of turn viewers off. So that's just kind of one of the things with Showtime, like I said. Some of their other comedies here, It's Gary Shandling Show, The Big C, Nurse Jackie, Web Therapy, House of Lies, all pretty successful in their own right. And then the infamous trash here, I'm going with Queer Duck. This is one of their adult animated shows. They don't really have much in the way of animation, as you can see, but this is one of them that they, attempted something new and just didn't really pay off for them all that much. I don't think Showtime is horrible by any means, but I just don't really, gravitate to any of these shows. I'd much rather watch like an HBO personally. So I think they're just in a good tier. Teletoon here. This is another Canadian network, and this is essentially the Canadian version of Cartoon Network. That is primarily what they are most known for, is the cartoons here. Braceface, Total Drama, 16, Stoked, Donkey Kong Country, Animal Crackers. Those are probably their most notable for, kids and early, younger demographic there. And then for some of their older shows, for the, more adult demographic, you have stuff like Clone High, Forget About It, Crash Canyon, and Sons of Butcher are all very successful for them. And then a couple other live action shows, Majority Rules and My Babysitter's a Vampire. Majority Rules is really one of the only shows on this whole list that I've seen all the way through, so it's personally my favorite. But I also really like Clone High and Total Drama as well, are fan favorites there that I personally grew up with, so I can definitely recommend those as well if you want good animated shows. The infamous trash here, they have two of the absolute worst kid shows that I thought were more, like, I always associated these shows with other networks that aired in the States here, but these are actually both Canadian produced shows that originally started their runs on Teletoon. So Teletoon gets the credit, unfortunately, for them, and that's very unfortunate because these two are Angela Anaconda and Caillou. Again, if you want more of a deep, dive into these, you can check out the Roasting the Worst shows I did with Matt and Mike, where we just tear these apart. Unfortunately, as much as I really want to put Teletoon higher, because I think they're very underrated, we have to stop somewhere. We can't put them super high because they do have Caillou after all, so we have to cap it somewhere. I think a meh is fair here. It honestly could be even bad because Angela Anaconda and Caillou are pretty awful shows. But, Majority Rules, Clone High, Braceface, all those are really solid. So we cut them some slack here a little bit. truTV here, one of the other, cable channels that has really kind of popped off in the last couple of years for some very unique shows here. Easily by far the lowest just quantity, right? There's like almost nothing that they have that's really that, notable or competitive. Most of their, more gimmicky shows end after a year, so there's not much to say on those. But the three that really stand out that they've had really good success with are Impractical Jokers, of course, Adam Ruins Everything, and The Carbonaro Effect. For me, those are the three that I watched the most growing up. I still absolutely love Impractical Jokers to this day. I watch it all the time. Very similar to, as we were talking about earlier with MTV, Ridiculousness, which that's like kind of all they play on truTV is Impractical Jokers, and the respective spin-off shows like After Party. But I really like it, so I'm not complaining too much about it. And then their infamous trash, 6 Degrees of Everything. Fuck the Fine Bros, they're assholes. Fuck that shit. Again, I can't put them too high just because they don't have the quantity of shows. They have like practically nothing. But I am going to put them at least in meh because I really do enjoy what they do have to offer, even if it's not much. The last few here we have to run through. Another one of the big broadcast networks, at least formerly, was UPN here. Kind of the, I guess, in-joke with UPN, even though it wasn't necessarily designed this way, but it kind of, after a while, they, saw that these types of shows were really popular, so it's what they often, were ordering and were the most successful when they aired them, were shows that targeted African Americans and more of a black demographic there. And you can definitely see that in the sitcoms they offered, which were Moesha, Everybody Hates Chris, All of Us, Half and Half, The Parkers, Malcolm and Eddie. Those were all huge African American sitcoms from the early 2000s, even the late 90s, some of them, that they had major success with. So props to UPN really for finding a very niche audience there and really sticking to it and having some really major accomplishments there. I think that's pretty cool. They also had a few dramas that were big for them, like the Star Trek shows Voyager and Enterprise. Veronica Mars, and then their reboot of The Twilight Zone, which was in 2002. They also had a few of the reality competitions here. Their most famous for sure was WWE SmackDown, which, for as much as I personally am not a fan of SmackDown or really wrestling in general, I always give these types of shows and give the fan base a huge amount of credit, because it's probably the single most consistent show that I've seen as far as like when it started to where it is now, all these years later, like 25 years. Some sort of WWE show has been on TV. And it's really never waned in popularity. I mean, as much as it doesn't really get talked about as much nowadays, it still has a huge fan base for it. And like Fox is the current one that does it, because UPN is no longer, around. Obviously, it was defunct a long time ago. So now it's Fox that does SmackDown. And even still, like after 25 years, I mean, they still pull in really good numbers. They have a huge audience share. So, again, even though I'm not a big fan of it, I give huge props and huge respect to that show for just keeping a consistent fan base for so long. America's Next Top Model is another one that I just don't care much about, and that one is still on too to this day, so still has a big fan base. And then actually, again, I didn't even know this, but they were one of the first to do Iron Chef here in the States. There was Iron Chef America, which was aired in 2005 on Food Network, as we saw earlier, but there was an earlier version of it from 2001, which aired on UPN for just a couple months. It was not big whatsoever, but I thought that was really cool that they were able to be one of the first to translate a really big show that was originally broadcast in Japan that was just called Iron Chef, and then they brought it here to the States, and they were the first to do it. So again, they get the credit there. So really, UPN, I mean, kind of a hidden as far as just how much influence they had and how many shows that they started with that are still on to this day or still have some sort of impact all these years later. One show that wasn't like that for sure was Homeboys in Outer Space. I mean, you can go anywhere online and look that this show is just awful for sure. So that's definitely not going to help their argument. But I mean, I got to give them at least a good tier, man. UPN definitely had a good amount of credibility behind them back in the day. And again, they were more niche. They definitely didn't have the most mainstream audience by any means, but they were really solid for what they did. And I think for stuff like WWE SmackDown, Iron Chef, and then those African-American sitcoms, I mean, you definitely got to give them props there for sure. The second to last network that we are going to discuss today is going to be USA Network. One of the other major cable networks that was big, I would say more back in the early 2000s into the late 2010s, I would say was really their peak run here. And again, they were definitely known primarily for their assortment of drama shows. Mr. Robot, Psych, Burn Notice, Suits, The Purge, Chucky, Monk, The 4400, and Royal Pains were really the ones that had the most impact for them and had the biggest followings there. I would say overall, like Mr. Robot was definitely one of those shows that put them into a space that became a lot more competitive alongside like an HBO or an FX or something. And that show really propelled their presence within a more premium, like Emmy Award winning sort of dynamic that they were really chasing at that point. Because when you look at shows comparatively that they were known for previously, like Suits or Burn Notice or something like that, those shows are a lot more like casual, episodic type of shows, like Case of the Week sort of style they kind of fall into. They're very much similar to like a Law and Order as far as the presentation is concerned. Mr. Robot had a much more like cynical, dark sort of tone to it that really shifted a lot of their programming following that. And then the other shows that came later were like The Purge and Chucky that continued that sort of style and presentation for them. But it's kind of interesting because I think they were honestly more successful with the Case of the Week, like the Sykes and the Burn Notice and Monk and stuff. I think those shows still have more of a following nowadays, especially in syndication, that if they had stuck with those, maybe they would still have a little bit more relevancy now. Because unfortunately, since then, they really haven't done much in the way of dramas at all. The only drama of the ones listed there that that's on right now is Chucky. And I mean, that show is successful, but like it's definitely a far cry from where they were back 10 years ago. So the bulk of their programming nowadays, unfortunately, is again similar to MTV, where it's just all reality shows, as well as WWF Monday Night Raw, which is still, that's something they've had on for years. So that's not going anywhere. And again, I give them major props for that, even though I'm not a wrestling fan. Definitely got to give them credibility there of just keeping that show as sustainable as it's been. But for the infamous trash here, I mean, you could pick out pretty much any one of their major reality shows that's just awful. But the one that I am most familiar with, unfortunately, is this show, Chris Lee Knows Best. This thing is a train wreck. This thing is so bad. We were actually watching it because they had a rerun of SVU on. So me and my mom were watching that, and then an episode of that shit came on, and we sat down for like 10 minutes watching it, and we just couldn't watch any more of it. It was just awful. So unfortunately, I mean, I hate to do this, but I think USA, honestly, is also going to go in the bad tier just because of the fact that right now, they have basically nothing. They have practically nothing that's interesting. I just mentioned they do have like SVU reruns and stuff, but we're just looking at original shows here. But yeah, USA, I mean, the fall from grace they had is just immeasurable. That shit is insane how far down they went. And unfortunately, like a lot of their other big dramas here, even though they were popular, they don't really have like the same sort of impact or legacy as like an HBO or an FX. When you take a look at like the critical standings they have, a lot of these are just kind of more fan favorites, and that's really as much as you can get out of them. There's not really a lot that sticks out with them or that sticks with you after you watch them. So I'd say USA, I hate to do it, but probably one of the weaker channels on this tier list here. And finally, wrapping it up here, let's talk about the WB and the Kids WB here. Another one I think is very overlooked here, especially for the broadcast networks. Very similar to UPN in the sense that they had a bit of a niche audience, definitely smaller audience that was gravitating towards them as kind of an alternative to something like NBC or CBS comparatively. But they found really big success with that. And then of course, merged with UPN to create the CW now, which is, as we talked about earlier, not doing so hot. But the WB at the time was really, really notable and had a lot of big shows there, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Gilmore Girls, Dawson's Creek, Felicity, Charmed, Seventh Heaven, Glory Days, Popular, Birds of Prey, Everwood, One Tree Hill, Smallville. They had a lot of big dramas there. They also had a great assortment of cartoons here. I think the cartoons very, very overlooked. You had stuff like Pinky and the Brain, Superman the Animated Series, Pokemon, Animaniacs, and Static Shock. They really were one of the first to put anime and imports of like Japanese shows onto American TV under their Kids TV or Kids WB rather block, and that really helped propel that subgenre into the stratosphere as far as how big it became now. And if you look at obviously the animation world today, anime is one of the biggest subcategories of it, and a lot of that credit, especially with how it evolved here in the States, goes back to WB and Kids WB for really doing a lot to make it known and make it give it some exposure here in America. And then you also have the sitcoms here, which again I think are very overlooked. You have the Jamie Foxx Show, What I Like About You, Steve Harvey's Show, Reba, Parenthood, and Smart Guy. Really a big fan of all of those. Jamie Foxx Show, maybe the weakest, but it's definitely the most popular of them. The infamous trash here, I'm going with another reality show, Beauty and the Geek. This show was kind of like a dating show where they had two different people. They had a big group of people, but, they would each get a pair, and it would be a bunch of women who were like, super hot and gorgeous, they were models and stuff. And then you have these very intelligent, like, more nerdy dudes that would pair up with them. Terrible idea, terrible execution. Again, definitely not worth your time there. But everything else the WB did, I think, was pretty damn good. And I would say definitely in contention for the most overlooked of these TV channels. So there you have it, my friends. I think this is the very first time, in fact, that we've done a tier list where we didn't have a bottom of the barrel tier channel here. Because again, because you're looking at such a big range of all of these channels and you're taking a look at so many shows for each one, there's naturally going to be good and bad, in each of them. So it's kind of hard to isolate it and say like it's all bad and it doesn't deserve anything. Because even the worst of the bunch, which in my opinion are Disney Plus and USA, still have a handful of, okay shows or still have some stuff that is redeemable. So I think that's pretty cool that we didn't have one that was in the bottom of the barrel, thankfully. We did have 3 in the God tier. There were CBS, Fox, and NBC, which, like I said earlier, I think just check all those boxes, right? Quality, quantity, and variety. And those were the things that we were looking for today. So there you go. That is my rank here of all of these TV channels. Definitely would love to know your thoughts on this one here, because I definitely have some niche channels in here and some more hot takes that I think you guys might disagree with. So whatever you have to say on those, I'd love to hear it. Other than that, have a great rest of your day, everybody, and we will see you in the next video.